Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and Prince William Network. My name is Victoria Woodhall and I'm your moderator for today's program. I'm the Associate Director and Curator of Education at the Farnsworth Art Museum and Wyeth Center located in Rockland, Maine. The purpose of this program is to introduce you to the works of N.C., Andrew, and Jamie Wyeth as witnesses to America and American history through the eyes of artists. The Wyeths have been documenting our history since the early 1900s, although what they've documented goes back hundreds of years. What you'll see today are several examples of their work, and we'll have the opportunity to hear personal insights and anecdotes through Jamie Wyeth himself. I invite you to listen and most of all to look. Paintings can evoke many responses through close observation and careful thought. The Wyeth family of painters use not only subject matter but color, style, and composition to communicate often more than one idea or emotion. Your response to the work is as important as the artist's intent. Understanding the idea behind the painting and the process can also be fascinating. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Jamie Wyeth. And Jamie, could you tell us about the three generations of the Wyeths and growing up to become an artist?
Well, great to be here. That's a big job. What I will say on the onset is that people say everybody paints in the Wyeth family except the dogs. My grandfather, N.C. Wyeth, who was born sort of in the late 1800s, was a book illustrator, children's book illustrator. And it was the great period of the golden age of illustration. So he did Treasure Isle and all those wonderful children's classics. And then my father, who was born in, I think, 1917, he sort of went a different route. He tried illustration, and then decided he really wanted to paint people, objects, and animals that he knew himself rather than work from stories and so forth. So he worked in his father's studio, studied under him and so forth. Then I came along in 1946 and sort of followed somewhat of a double route. I sort of was similar to my grandfather in that I illustrated some books, but then mainly went on and did paintings of people and really events in history that sort of affected me.
When did you decide to become an artist?
I don't even remember. It was totally natural. I mean, as any kid, I would go to a movie or read a book and then run home and sort of draw it and so forth. So I sort of say I really finally decided to be an artist when I left school in the 6th grade. I was going to a public school, and I decided I wanted more time to paint. And so that's when I became serious. And people say, well, how could you have known at that age? But I really did. That's all I wanted to do was paint.
Excellent. Well, why don't we start by looking at one of the images that recently you did some footage at the Brandywine Museum, and you talked a little bit about N.C.'s work. So why don't we start there?
Great. This is a painting, again, by my grandfather, who really was largely known as an illustrator. And this is an illustration. He mainly did children's books. But the interesting thing about he as an illustrator is that he didn't paint for children. I mean, his idea was don't paint down to a child, paint on all levels. And if you look at the drama of this is Jim Hawkins and Long John Silver from Treasure Island, a great story by Robert Louis Stevenson. He created this excitement, and think of this too, the fact that he knew these paintings in the book were only going to be this big in the book, but here he did these enormous paintings, and his thought behind that was to throw himself into it, make it as exciting as you can, the figure of him moving along. And then when it's reduced in size in the book, it'll jump out of the page. And his books are still the most popular illustrated children's classics that existed. It was during the golden age of illustration. And you got to remember, this is before there was television. There were movies, but they had no sound. That's when he did most of these paintings. And it brought these stories a richness to children's lives. And the other very interesting thing, I think, if you read the books, such as Treasure Island, the passage that he chose to illustrate usually was the sort of uninteresting part of the story. He wanted just to enlarge things, not the most exciting part where there are people killing one another. He picked the thing of Hawkins being pulled along by Long John Silver. It's sort of a small part of the story. So it's the drama, again, that you can create in painting, really using, in his case, he made up all these things. He rarely used a model. This was all in his head. He never traveled to the Pacific where this story took place. It was all sort of done in a studio here in Chadds Ford. So it's all about imagination.
As you said, these are so full of imagination. I know he used words from books, but did he use props or models to paint
He
these?
would use his children, my father, for instance, as models. But really, he was just a keen observer of life. And he never used photographs. his studio was full of costumes after he died in 1945. I wasn't even born. But I would go in there as a child, and here were these suits of armor and cutlasses and wonderful things that he used in these illustrations. But he created this all sort of in his head. I mean, it was something, as I said earlier, he never traveled. He just really remained in his studio in Chadds Ford and in Maine.
I understand he also painted landscapes and still lifes?
He would occasionally. He felt he needed to sort of balance. I mean, the illustration part of his life was just obviously working with an author's words. He then felt it was good to just go out and sort of do, as he called them, sort of easel paintings. Mm-hmm. And I think they're interesting in his work, but to me, his greatest work really are his illustrations, that they bring these things to life and really take on the story. I mean, the story goes beyond just what was in the book.
Well, why don't we take a look at one of the still lives? I think we have some footage of that.
Great. This is a painting by my grandfather, N.C. Wyeth, and that I've always adored. I mean, as I've looked at this as a child and whatnot, and it just staggered me when you think, I mean, look at this bottle. This is just ordinary, as what they call a still life, where he set the thing up in his studio. And here is this old bottle with dust on it, and he sort of rubbed the dust off, and that whole effect of painting, I think, is extraordinary. And here's a reflection of his wife's garden, my grandmother's garden, and the way he's done this little cup with a highlight on it. And I always was just intrigued that he was able to get this sort of effect in oil paint. And then if you read up here, which really staggered me, he has taken the end of his brush while the paint was still wet and scratched in NCW, his initials, in 1924, and then he's written 3 hours. In other words, he did this painting in 3 hours. It still depresses me that a man could have painted this in just 3 hours. I struggle away on things for days, months sometimes. And at times he worked a long time and worked, but here is an example of the excitement of painting, that he just did this thing, sat down, and literally completed it in 3 hours. I think is extraordinary.
3 hours to paint that painting, that's fascinating. I mean, but to paint that realistic, doesn't it take an large amount of craftsmanship? I mean, power of observation. How do you develop that?
Well, it does, and he would study, and he would do things, he'd draw them, study them. Again, I mean, set up this glass and that thing to sort of do paintings of and he wasn't always, these weren't always sort of book illustrations. These were things that he wanted to practice. So then when he was working on a book, he could just grab the brush and do exactly what he wanted, you know, to get that excitement and so forth. And so he would do these still lifes, but oftentimes, other than books, he was commissioned to do paintings.
Well, tell me about the commissions.
Well, people would come, there were war bonds, there were various banks wanting to do murals. He worked enormous murals, I mean, murals that were 90 feet by 100 feet, just extraordinary. So he was a phenomenally versatile painter. And then, of course, he was asked to do things for the war to sort of support the U.S. and so forth. So he covered the whole gamut.
And I believe he brought a lot of his illustrative skills, I mean, the power of that image into those commissioned pieces. We can look at several of those now.
Yes, sure.
Let's start with The Unknown Soldier.
This is, it's sort of interesting to me. This is a very sort of moving thing with The Unknown Soldier. And he was commissioned to do this for, in fact, this was a book. And interestingly enough, I was commissioned last year by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to do an image of a Vietnam veteran in front of the wall. And I chose, sort of subconsciously, not because of my grandfather, to do an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War period. And I think we're going to show it later in the show. So it's interesting how years later I've sort of, not consciously because my grandfather did it, but there is a correlation and a connection between all three of us.
And later on, I mean, even though these still were commissioned works, in the works such as The War Letter, did he not bring some of his own personal stories into it?
Yes, in fact, the painting, The War Letter, that painting depicts his mother and father. His brother was in the war, this is the First World War, and they were getting letters from him off in Europe and so forth. And he saw them one day down by the Charles River, this was done in Massachusetts, and then created this image. He then actually did 2 paintings of this image. So, you know, in fact, he used real life many times. I mean, that was something that he saw, so it wasn't totally in his mind. But then if you look at the painting, the smoke rising, it's almost sort of designed, abstract and whatnot. So he took life, but then sort of built on it.
And the one last illustration, actually it was a poster, I believe, for Buy War Bonds. To me, it has everything of N.C. Wyeth in it. It has the drama, it has the image pointing right at you. Should we look at that one? Could you just tell us a little bit about that, the war bond, the commission, the effort made through that
Well,
poster?
it was interesting to me, and it's happened to me also, where the government's come to me to do things that a painter can have an effect on. I mean, I'm upset by war, obviously, and you can do it through your paintings. You can express yourself. I mean, he was very pro the U.S. at that point. I think they were sort of not winning the war, and so he did this Uncle Sam with a flag flying behind him and the planes flying over. It was great drama, and then of course it contributed to the effort. I mean, people would see this image, and this image was stuck in people's houses. They bought them as posters, and then in return they would buy war bonds and so forth. So it's interesting that a painter can have that sort of effect on his own sort of circumstance and the world that he lives in.
And one last question before we move on to your father, Andrew. Your grandfather's illustrations, when I go into a museum or a gallery, his stand out. There's something that says N.C. Wyeth. I mean, what is that? What things did your grandfather
Well, I think that they jump out of the page. There was one person who was talking to my father and I and saying, you know, N.C. Wyeth really isn't really good for book illustration because the paintings jump too much out of the page. Well, that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted those things, those pirates, to come right out and grab somebody around the neck. I mean, that was what he was intending, not to stay within the book and so forth. And I think great painting, whether it's illustration or just easel painting and whatnot, should do that, should excite you, should get you sort of, make you sort of jump up and say, well, that is fascinating.
But your father, Andrew, he has a whole different way of looking at things. He has a whole different kind of drama, still a drama. Can you talk about moving to Andrew now, his work a little bit?
Yeah, and my father is more inward, really. I mean, N.C. Wyeth, as I say, jumps out and grabs you and so forth. Andrew Wyeth's work, my father's work, is very sort of inward. It's sort of his life. A lot of people say, well, they're lonely paintings because there are very few people in them and whatnot. But that is his life. He left school also in the 5th grade, I think it was, due to illness. And so he spent a lot of time alone. And many of his paintings you'll see really are of his surroundings, where he was raised in Chadds Ford and in Maine. And so instead of sort of using an author's ideas or images, he created his world within his own. I mean, his mind, which is, I think, fascinating. To me as a child, I was sort of more excited about my grandfather's work than I was my father's work.
And he's painted primarily in Chadds Ford and in Maine.
That's right, those two places. He also has never traveled. We all the Wyeths, we feel very strongly that you ought to just stay and zero in where you live. I mean, the more you know about a person or a tree or a hill, the more meaningful the painting is going to be. I think that's the uniqueness that we try to sort of work on.
Well, why don't we take a look at one of your fathers? I think we have some footage of you talking about The Night Sleeper.
Great. I thought it'd be interesting for me to show you that this is a painting by my father, and what is sort of interesting that here is a painter who paints things from his everyday life. Well, this painting by my father this is our family dog, this is the mill that we live in Pennsylvania, my mother and father live, and although it's everyday life, as you can see, it's very theatrical. I mean, look at the whiteness of that building in the moonlight, and then this is towards you in shadow and so forth. It's very much like a theater. And I think it's interesting because theater in painting can exist whether you're painting a dancer or painting a dog, a family dog. It has all the elements of drama. The interesting thing with his work too, everything is in very sharp focus. If you look, that little window there is absolutely sharp as his nose on the dog and whatnot. So it's again a different approach to painting. My grandfather had his approach, I have my approach, and my father has his. So it makes sort of 3 generations of really 3 different approaches to sometimes the same thing, the same sort of dramatic elements, but in different uses. You know, in that painting, it's sort of fascinating because here that was his dog. That was a scene that exists in my family's house, looking out the window of the mill, as I explained. Andrew Wyeth, sort of perplexing in that then he'll turn and do a painting like Snowhill, which is almost completely imaginary. Yes, the people in the painting, as when they pull it up, they'll show you, are people that pose for him and whatnot, but the whole thing is an imaginary thing. So he's a funny combination of his father and his own sort of thing, where he's not needing a book, but sort of creating images out of pretty much his head again.
Well, why don't we look at Snowhill?
A lot of my father's work is autobiographical, and in this particular painting, Snowhill, each of these figures around this sort of maypole are people that have posed for him through the years. Half of them really don't exist anymore, most have died, and so he did this sort of portrait of them, and as you see, they're all sort of faceless. And again, although these people existed, they were a major part of my father's life and his work, he's created a sort of theater out of it. I mean, where would you ever see a maypole with snow and so forth? And the other kind of interesting thing, if you follow the ribbons down, each goes to a various model, but there's one ribbon that goes to nobody, and I'm assuming, although he won't say, that's he, that the final ribbon is him dancing. But the point of showing you this is that the fact that this is, again, is everyday life. This isn't something out of a theater on Broadway or in California or Chicago. This is the Pennsylvania Hills. This is a farm that he's painted years on, the Kerner farm. And again, these figures are all people that pose for him over 30, 40, 50 years of painting. So I think it's a great painting, but the fact that it's autobiographical, I think, makes it even more interesting.
I'm gonna go?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the interesting thing also, I think, about Andrew Wyeth is there's a element of sort of danger in his work. I mean, a lot of people see his things, they say, oh, look, it's an old barn, or it's a dog sleeping and so forth. And it's not unlike Robert Frost, the American poet, where people read Stopping by Wood in the Snow even sounds like a lovely story. In fact, it's very scary. And I think Andrew Wyeth's work, if you really look and study his work, some of the things are very creepy and very kind of death is always sort of at the back door and so forth. And not only in images of animals and landscapes and so forth, but in his portraits of people, I think. He also brings this sort of forbidding sort of thing. And that, as a child, fascinated me. Then I made the bridge between my grandfather and my father. That, you know, here was N.C. Wyeth doing these exciting knights of armor and pirates, and my father was just painting weeds and whatnot. But then as I grew older, you know, 15, 16, I started to see that he was as dramatic, really, as his grandfather, as his father.
You know, I can't agree more. I have to tell you, when I walk through museums with students and we look at your father's works, I ask them to stand there an extra few minutes because you originally see just what you are, what's in front of you, but if you look a lot longer, you see an awful lot more. There's always something in there.
Yes. Okay.
And the question always does come around to portraits, whether it's a self-portrait, a portrait of the family, everyday life. It's a natural question, and I think the work in the three generations of the Wyeths demands that question. And I'm curious as to, you know, your interest in portraits.
Well, I've always been fascinated in portraiture, and I think, and the portraits that I've done are generally people that I've known. I mean, they're not, I don't do commission portraits. I'm not hired to do a portrait, because that's very difficult to work with somebody that all you're seeing is their nose and their two eyeballs and whatnot. I want to sort of get inside the person. So most of the portraits are people that I know their background, where they were raised, how they lived, and so forth. And if I don't know that with like Nureyev and whatnot, then I spend time with the sitter or the person they don't really sit and try to get as much as their life into the portrait. So
you've done portraits since an early age?
Yes, very early age, and usually the early portraits of mine are just are kids that I grew up with. I mean, there's I think we have draft age here, and that was a young friend of mine who was draft age.
Well, why don't we just take a look at that one?
I wanted to show you this particular one because, again, this was a great friend of mine, and it's, again, using sort of everyday objects. I mean, I got him to pose. He loved motorcycles at that time. As you can see, he's wearing a motorcycle jacket. And this was during the Vietnam War, which was a very unpopular war back in the 60s. And I thought this was sort of showing the defiance. A lot of kids were against the war and protested and didn't want to go to the war and tore up their draft cards. And oddly enough, the day I finished this painting, he got his draft notice and in fact was drafted. And so I titled the painting Draft Age, and it's sort of become symbolic to people. I get interesting letters from Vietnam veterans and whatnot about this painting, that this is showing the defiance of youth and and don't always go along with what authority says and so forth. So it's sort of it's a statement. It's become a sort of symbol in an interesting way that I hadn't intended really when I began the painting. I was really just doing a friend of mine. It may have been in the back of my mind, but it wasn't overtly symbolic, but now it's become a sort of symbol.
Jamie, I have to ask, how old were you when you painted that painting?
I think I was 19.
19 years old. The thing I find fascinating about that painting in particular and some paintings that we're going to see in a few moments is that here's a portrait that you painted when you were 19 of a friend. And because of the way he was dressed, the way that he stood, and some of the consequences around and the situation around that painting, it became symbolic of the Vietnam era. And here's a portrait that you painted for a different reason but became symbolic. And I think that's very important to mention because a lot of your works and your fathers and grandfathers also bring in other, new meaning later on.
Well, and that's what intrigues me about painting, of course, is that these paintings, once they finish my studio, they take on a life of their own, of which you have no control of. I certainly have no control of. And that intrigues me. That's where painting to me is, I think, far beyond photography and whatnot, because there's so many elements that swirl in there when you look at it. It isn't just click like a camera in a photograph. It's sort of a mood, a different lights of the day and whatnot, all combined into one painting. And I think to me it's limitless.
And it's okay with you, whatever the viewer sees.
Absolutely, and I never intrude on a viewer. And when somebody says, oh, I see this in that painting, I never, if maybe and I haven't seen that in the painting, I won't say, oh, you're wrong. Because paintings have so many different elements in it. That's what's so exciting about art.
Well, I also find it interesting. I mean, let's look at another comparison now, because this painting became about Vietnam, yet recently you were commissioned and asked to paint about Vietnam again. And we can look at that now. Night Vision?
Yes, Night Vision. Exactly. It's a very recent painting of mine. I was approached by the Vietnam Memorial veterans who have a memorial in Washington to commemorate. It was the 20th anniversary of the memorial. And so I went down to the memorial, and in this painting, if you look at this, that is the memorial in Washington. But I sort of was interested because it has a shape almost like an airfield in Vietnam. And I then got more and more involved, and then I thought there's a thing called night vision goggles that they use now and they used in Vietnam. And if you look at all this sort of strange feeling of speckled stars, I was trying to create night vision. I literally put night vision goggles on and did some drawings with it, wearing them. Of course, when I first finished the painting, some friends of mine came into my studio and said, Jamie, what's happened to you? And they looked at this and thought, what, these weird colors? And then a Vietnam veteran, a guy who'd been in the war in Vietnam, came in and got it instantly, said, oh my gosh, it's night vision. So that's where I got the title and so forth. And I thought the idea of a lone figure, in all wars, the tragedy to me is that, the boys and the girls who died will forever be 18 years old. And as you see, he's sort of anonymous. You can't see his eyes, it's in shadow, or her eyes. And I wanted the sort of anonymous thing, sort of the anonymous soldier. It's a very, again, a symbolic painting. You can see the American flag fluttering above this. But again, the memorial then transformed, in my mind, into a landing strip in a war zone. So it has a lot of sort of emotions for me in it. And remarkably, it's had an amazing response from veterans. I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of letters from this image.
Jamie, that painting really pops out at you. I mean, you have red and green. You have complementary colors in there, and that's the highest amount of contrast you can get as a painter. And probably you came around that because of the night vision goggles. But I wonder, how do you balance being asked to document something as documentation or as a commission and your ideas as an artist and as a painter?
I don't really make any distinction between the two, really. I mean, I'm actually a rather boring person because all I do is paint. And whether the inspiration comes from a commission or it's something that comes into my head and so forth. I mean, that's where art is fascinating. And I'm in, I think, an enviable position. And I think young people should be encouraged to get into the art field because here you can, and through my paintings, I've touched, the Vietnam era. I've gone political things. I've done NASA with rockets to the moon and so forth and met all these types and whatnot. And the basis, the anchor that I've had is painting. I mean, it's not that I want to jump in these things. It's just that if the opening comes, why not? And through the medium of paint, I'm able to sort of record, and that's what intrigues me most of all about painting, is really recording. And certainly with the history today and what's happening in this country and the world, I want to record it, and my medium is paint.
But truthfully, I mean, you have been asked to document some of the most amazing, sometimes difficult moments in American history. I mean, you were the only artist in the Watergate trials. You were asked to document the Eyewitness to Space program, the portrait of John F. Kennedy, September 11th. We have some of those images. If we could show those now, maybe you could speak to.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
I don't know what. Yeah, this was down in Cape Canaveral at that time, and I was fascinated by the drama of the lights. That's the rocket ready to go to the moon. And here I was, I'd come from an island in Maine, and I'd been flown down and landed, in the Florida, and went to the base of this Saturn booster, and there it was on its way, ready to go to the moon. So to me, it was such a mind-boggling experience, and as a painter, I thought, if this is the only way I'm going to see this, then I'm going to record it as best I can. And as a consequence, you have this sort of dramatic effect of the searchlights on the rocket booster. And with President Kennedy, I was asked when I was very young, I don't know, I think I was 16 or 17, to do, President Kennedy had died, in fact, and I was asked, would I do the posthumous portrait of him in the White House, and for the White House, and I actually turned that down, and decided just then I became intrigued with President Kennedy. I did this, the two brothers Bobby was then living, I did a portrait of him and then combined it into this because I wanted to look alive. And, again, here's something, this is a man I never even met. And I created this, out of some photographs, obviously, in films. And now it sort of has a life of its own. It's now the national stamp in Ireland and whatnot. And it's very curious that a painting can have sort of relevance. Makes it sort of intriguing. And that's why I think the arts, and in particular with me, painting, is such an exciting field to be in. I then was asked after September 11th, a New York newspaper, 5 days after the terrible event, came to me and said, would I do a painting for the cover of the newspaper for their special edition? And I said, well, I've never done newspaper work. And they said, your grandfather would do it instantly, And so up I went to ground zero, and if you look at this image, actually this figures are like the Iwo Jima photograph of putting the flag in, and I transformed it into the policeman and the fireman and the hospital worker and the rescue worker. And then the fifth element in the painting is the dog down on the left. At that point, the dog was an important part of the rescue effort. So, and this painting then became sort of an iconic image of that. It's raised a lot of money. We've raised over $1 million for the Children's Fund of the Twin Towers. So again, a painting has had an impact aside from just a pretty picture on the wall.
Yes, I'm sure that was a difficult painting to paint.
Well, it was. I mean, how can you possibly put it into one painting? The emotions, the terrible event, and so forth. And so again, I sort of tried to do, not consciously, but out of it came sort of a symbolic image that I hope, and it seems to have touched a number of people, and it's raised, as I say, a lot of money for the Twin Tower Children's Fund, which is great.
Jimmy, I also understand that when you go to work, let's say a portrait, back to a portrait, you mentioned in the John Kennedy portraits that you spend a lot of time studying, drawing, sketching, looking, moving. Even in this case, you did films. And recently there was an exhibition capturing Nureyev, James Wyeth Paints the Dancer, and that exhibition had over 60 drawings and paintings that you did of just one dancer, and that was not even all of them. There were hundreds of drawings and sketchbooks.
Yes.
Could you and who was Nureyev to you, and how did you decide to paint him?
Well, I had seen he was this amazing creature from born in Russia and whatnot, and became a dancer, and then defected, left Russia because he really wanted to dance around the world, and so he left in France, defected, and then became world famous as a dancer. I went to see him several times perform. And to me, it was extraordinary because so often performers, they're amazing on stage. You see them off stage and they're kind of uninteresting. Nureyev was as exciting off stage as he was on. And I thought, I just had this incredible urge to want to record him. I mean, here there are photographs of him, films and whatnot, but I felt I just really want to do this. So I ended up spending a year and a half sort of bird dogging him wherever he went. He let me follow him in rehearsals and makeup and dressing rooms and so forth. And I did hundreds of drawings. It was almost an obsession with me. But, and I even measured the length of his legs, the width of his ankle, and And it became a complete sort of, and out of it came this body of work, which is, he has now died, very sadly, but in a curious way, he sort of lives on, to me at least, and to some of the people that have seen the exhibition, in this group of paintings.
When you were organizing that exhibition, I understand you kept finding sketchbooks from that time period. How many sketchbooks did you fill up?
I don't know. Lots. And when I say sketchbooks, you know, probably on one page there'd be one line, which would mean something to me, but you or most people looking at it would say, what on earth is that? You know, but these are things, they're sort of, for me, they're like, for a writer, they have notes and whatnot. Sketches and drawings for me are, you know, just things to sort of aid me in the completion of a series of paintings.
Well, we have a number of clips of you actually talking about some of these Nureyev paintings, and I think we have one of the sketchbooks.
Oh, great. These are 3 sketchbooks, of which there are 100 probably I did of Nureyev, following him around and doing little drawings as he'd sit, as he'd be makeup at his before a performance. And if you could read these, they're all sort of measurements that I've made. I use this tool called a caliper, and so I would take, for instance, the size of his head, and I'd say how tall he was. He'd be 6 heads high. And I became sort of obsessed with this. And you probably know, if you draw and you draw figures and whatnot, you need to get right proportions. And I became obsessed that I wanted Nureyev proportions to be absolutely accurate. He, of course, had been photographed many times in dance and so forth, but nobody had really studied him and studied not only his physiognomy, but what was sort of going on inside his head. And I would measure and measure and measure. At one point he said, you measure so much you could make me a suit. And I literally could have built a suit for him because I had all these various sizes and measurements. And I, as I say, this tool I would use and see the width of his arm, and all these notations are written. These are all brief drawings done very momentarily. I didn't want him just to sit frozen posing, and so I had to work very, very fast and try painting a dancer. I mean, they move very quickly. So it certainly was good training for me.
Jamie Nureyev was a dancer. He was flying across the stage. You had to work quickly. How do you develop those skills?
Just by working a lot. And you know, some people say, well, why didn't you just take a photograph and sort of copy the photograph? Well, to me, the essence of Nureyev was, I mean, there are many photographs of him and so forth, but I wanted to sort of do my interpretation and through these series of paintings and drawings to create sort of what I felt Rudolf Nureyev was as a dancer and as a person. So to me, it's sort of going beyond just the actual, I mean, yes, I measured him and all that, and I wanted that to be somewhat accurate, but it was more this obsessiveness to get to the core of the person, and the only way to do that is to keep drawing him. And yes, it's an oxymoron for a painter to be doing some dancer who's moving all the time. And I never really had him pose. I mean, he never would sort of sit like this and pose for me. And so I learned to just work very quickly. And again, some of these drawings are just a brief line, but to me, it looks like hieroglyphics to most people, but to me it means something, and that went into the work.
So drawing things over and over and over is a valuable skill, do you think, for any art student?
I think so. It's the tools. You know, to just apply, do it. I mean, I hate, a lot of times I don't want to draw, but you have to force yourself. Then, when things really start clicking, when all of a sudden you get excited by an idea or an object, then you have those tools. I mean, you're able then to sort of do whatever shape you want. And, you know, painting is very individual. I mean, the art schools, it always is a question to me, well, what is the validity of an art school? I mean, what it is, I think they instill a discipline into somebody. They say, all right, if you're interested in the arts, then you've got to draw, you've got to study this. Then you can go out and abstract anything or do whatever you want. But you have those basics. To me, it's like a surgeon. I mean, you know, a surgeon has to be able to sort of make the incisions. It's the same with the art.
And I imagine in this case, given that he was a dancer and his art was his physical form, the calipers and the measurements were essential. What if you don't have calipers? I mean, how do you get proportions like that?
I sometimes just take my pencil and just measure, you know, put it where it is and then measure. As you see on the drawings, it has so many lengths of something is the length of his leg or the length of his arm. And, you know, it's interpretive. But it's just sort of the thing of going through the effort of doing it, I think, is sort of important and seems to work with me.
Well, why don't we look at some of the clips of the actual paintings that you produced after the sketches.
Yes.
I think Curtain Call is the next one we have.
titled Curtain Call. And I chose to do it because in the end of a ballet, when Nureyev would finish dancing, he would come out and acknowledge the audience. The crowd would be screaming and clapping madly and so forth. And it fascinated me that he would come out singly and sort of acknowledge the crowd. The light was very intense on him. You could see nothing else but sort of a black void around. You had this sort of almost lavender light. And the audience would be throwing flowers onto the stage. And if he were dancing alone, he would pick up one of the roses, as you see in his hand, and he then would thrust it to the audience, and the audience would go absolutely crazy. The other times when he would be with a partner, such as Margot Fontaine, the great partner that he danced so many years with, he then would kneel and present her with a rose. And it always, to me, it was sort of poignant, the final. Obviously, in dancing, there is no encore. Once the dance is completed, that's it. And here he's sort of singly alone, and almost the shape of him in the shadow, from the shadow of the strong lights and so forth. It's sort of a dramatic painting, and yet to me it epitomizes the sort of fragility of dance, the fact that once you see a performance, it'll never be seen again. Dance looks sort of absurd on film, and this way the single dancer is sort of bidding goodbye to his audience and disappearing finally behind the curtain.
So with that painting, you chose a moment that you witnessed repeatedly, the curtain call at the end of each performance.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was something that I would see either I'd be in the wings and whatnot. It happened obviously at the end of every performance. But then I went on to, years later, after really Nureyev had died, then I thought, you know, I have all these drawings, I have all his physiognomy still in my head. Why not continue on with it? And in a way, it was sort of interesting because Nureyev, being a dancer, their body is very important to them, how they look to the audience or to anybody. And so he was very demanding. I mean, he would look at a drawing of mine and saying, you know, if I was drawing his foot, he'd say, you know, my foot's more beautiful than that and whatnot. So he had that sort of demand. So then, after his death, I was able to take all these drawings, these hundreds of drawings, and then create images that I'd started back then, such as, there's one with he with a fur hat and whatnot, and his fur coat. I had done a few drawings of that, but I was able then, 10 years later, to go on further with a portrait. I think it's here, don't we have it?
It is, we have. Why don't we look at that now?
Great. The story behind this painting was, I was fascinated when he was performing in New York, for instance. He would have 2 matinee days a week in which he did a performance in the middle of the day, not just in the evening. And when he would finish that midday performance, he then would come back to his dressing room, put on his fur coat and his fur hat, and we'd leave the theater, and there'd always be an enormous crowd waiting outside of well-wishers and autograph seekers. And he would have left his makeup on, and you know, the red almost lipstick and the white pancake makeup and the eyes sort of thing. And I was intrigued that this was almost a performance in itself. I mean, here was this remarkable face, and we'd walk then down the street, the two of us, and people would stop in their tracks at this amazing looking man with Russian furs and this intense expression with this sort of heavy makeup on. I became intrigued by that. To me, it was almost as if he was doing another performance. And I did a later one of he, in fact, in street clothes. Here he is again in makeup, as you can see the heavy blue eye mascara and so forth. But I started the thing with the same fur hat, and then one day he wore this beret, which he wore a lot, and so I thought even more interesting. Here he is, full makeup with a beret and a big coat on, and then he had his purple scarf he always wore, and you can see there's a makeup from his face on the scarf that would rub as he'd walk down the street. I became just fascinated with this image, and oddly enough, he rather didn't like the idea of me doing this. He said, that is not performance. He said, this is a different thing. And so I unfortunately didn't go much further with it, but I felt in a way it was getting closer to what Rudolf Nureyev was really about. I mean, his performance was not only on stage, but it was off stage. There was never sort of a difference to him. He was always sort of, as they say, on stage. So these paintings are really based on that.
So in that painting right there, Purple Scarf, you changed from a fur hat to a beret. I mean, right in the middle of the painting. Do you do that a lot?
Yeah, I do, and I kind of like the change, and I like that you see it. If you look at that painting, you still can see the halo of the fur hat. I mean, it's sort of a living thing in a way, I think, painting to me, and the painting. And I like an audience, they look at it and say, well, why does he have that around there? I think that makes it even more intriguing. It's more spontaneous, not so planned. And my paintings are not planned. They're very sort of spontaneous and just happen. I try not to sort of freeze myself by saying this is where I want to end up and so forth.
I think it's fascinating in these two cases that you could, 10 years after Nureyev's death, go back into your sketchbooks and your mind and your original drawings and complete these works. And I know you have mentioned to me before that you think he would approve of those. But it is you as a painter now versus you as a painter in 1977. The question I have really, though, is what was the difference between, and what is the difference between working from the model and working from the drawings?
Well, in a funny full circle, it's very much what my grandfather did. It's sort of going back to N.C. Wyeth. I mean, he would sort of create a world out of like sketches, like the book and so forth, and then create these paintings. In a way, with my paintings of Nureyev, is very similar to what my grandfather did. So I think it sort of intrigued me that in a way I'm sort of going back to that.
Well, at this time, we would like to invite the viewing audience to call on your questions. The number is 1-800-672-0067. Before we move on with the Nureyev works, Jamie, I find it fascinating that you work in a variety of different mediums. I don't know if it's noticeable to the public, but what are you painting with there? And what are you painting on?
Well, the interesting thing, most of the Nureyev things were done on cardboard. I'm mad about cardboard. And when I say cardboard, these literally were packing crates for the costumes and whatnot, and the sets. And not only do I like working on the surface of cardboard, but I love the idea with Nureyev, who, you know, you have the elegance of ballet and whatnot, and here these things are done on shipping crates, you know, and some of them still have the labels on them and whatnot. I think, I don't know why I'm comfortable with cardboard, but I just love the looks of it. And, you know, I think you can paint on anything. I mean, that's, again, the great thing with painting is there really are no rules. I mean, the mediums that I combine mediums, I combine watercolor and oil, varnish. I mean, you know, my agents, my dealers are very upset these things are going to disappear years from now, but I don't think so. I mean, they're pretty good, I hope.
Well, I believe the next painting and the last one I think that we'll look at more to Nureyev is done on cardboard, is it?
That's a huge sheet of cardboard. It was, I think an icebox came in that, actually. Not some set.
And after this one, I think we'll have time to take questions from
Great.
our audience. So let's look at this last clip.
This very large painting was really sort of my tribute to Nureyev after he died. In ballet, as you probably know, many times the prince dies in the end of the ballet, and I always thought it was sort of a moving thing. So I decided to do him prone as if he died at the end of the performance, that this was the final dance of the prince. And then I was intrigued. I had some drawings that I'd done of ballerinas. I thought this was sort of a wonderful position, as if they're sort of paying homage to him. And I asked I live on a farm in Pennsylvania, and I asked some girls who work on the farm, could they come pose for me in this position? So they came into my studio, and they tried to get into that position. Now, I ask you, try getting into that position. It is a very difficult position. And what it proved to me is that dancers change, their body changes through the years of training and so forth. Anatomically, literally, their body changes. And I finally had to hire a ballerina to come pose to do these figures. And she, of course, instantly got in that position. So and I think it gave a sort of drama to the whole painting, that here he was, the end of his sort of career almost, and here were the ballerinas that he danced through all his life with, and they were sort of weeping and paying homage to him. So it's more of a painting, really, although I saw it many times on stage, it really was more of a tribute in a way to him.
Okay, just one last question, and we'll take questions. What's your favorite painting of all these?
I can honestly say that my favorite painting is the one I'm working on right this moment. And I never tell anybody what I'm working on, but it is. I mean, the one that I'm most excited about is what I'm doing right now.
Well, I can't wait to see it. I need to see that.
I'm not dodging the question. Actually, that's quite honest.
We now have some time for some questions for our viewers. And again, the phone number is 1-800-672-0067. Let's hear from you now.
How would you compare
In a funny sense, I'm probably more influenced by my grandfather. Although I worked with my father, he lived in the same house, obviously, when we were growing up. But my grandfather's had more of an influence on me.
Another question?
I have a question for you. When you were growing up, training to become an artist, did you have any major setbacks that just you thought was going to destroy your career as an artist? And if so, how did you overcome it?
You know, honestly, I have major setbacks every day in my studio. I mean, painting is not easy for me. I don't find it easy, and I find the technique and whatnot, and that's good in a way to have those setbacks. I mean, I think it rather than just gliding through and so forth. So yeah, I'm very depressed about things that I'm working on and whatnot, and you just that's why I say you have to force yourself to paint sometimes. I mean, I don't always run to the studio in the morning saying I can't wait to paint. I mean, sometimes I got to really push myself in there, but the highs are when things really do work, and that you keep hoping for will come along.
Another question from the audience?
Did you experience a lot of criticism when you're first starting out, considering you come from a family of artists?
Well, yeah, oddly enough, we're constantly compared all the time, and that's difficult to be compared to your father and grandfather all the time. And then the Wyeths have a peculiar thing where we're fairly popular with audiences, and the art critical world, the world of art criticism, they're very anti-Wyeth, and it's under the premise that anything that's popular, that's good, cannot be good art, which I, of course, don't believe. But their premise is always that if it has a popular appeal, then it's suspect. It reaches too large an audience. They love to say it's too accessible, whatever that means.
What inspires you the most when you're painting?
Just what inspires me most about painting is the act, really, of recording, in a way, to constantly want to record. Now, why I want to record, why I wanted to do Nureyev, I have no idea. At the time, I was just so wildly excited that that's all I wanted to do.
Where would you say you get most of your ideas from?
Mostly from my head, actually. And being a keen observer. I mean, just looking at things. But it can come from magazines. It can come from a movie. I never know what triggers it. I'll have people come to me and say, "Gee, I saw an interesting face you love to paint." Well, I'm not interested in interesting faces. What I am interested in is a face that I've known for years, something that I can go beyond just the face and go into the head of the person. That's what interests me. I'm not interested in interesting trees or great hills. I want trees and hills that I've known all my life. That's what really inspires me.
Okay. Are there museums in other areas of the country that where we can see Wyeth family artworks?
Yeah, most public museums in this country have our paintings. There's the Brandywine River Museum in Pennsylvania that has a large body of our work, and the Farnsworth Museum in Rockland, Maine, that has both of those two institutions. But really, a lot of the Seattle Art Museum has some of my paintings, the Dallas Museum. So go to your local museums or call up and just say, "Do you got any Wyeths there?" Hopefully they have them. Hopefully they're not in the cellar.
I was just wondering, do you ever use any other kinds of medium besides just paints, like charcoal or anything like that?
Yes, I love charcoal. Charcoal I'm crazy about. I use lots of different mediums, oddly enough. But then, mediums are peculiar to the person. My father, for instance, works in a medium called tempera, which is dried color mixed with the yolk of egg. I tried that when I was very young, and it was too dry for me. I like the sort of lusciousness of oil and so forth. And so I try all sorts of mediums. And a lot of the things you saw were what they call combined mediums. And everything's in there. Charcoal, ink, crayon, everything. Anything to get the effect.
I know you've said that you paint all the time. Is there a future project that you've been hoping on doing? A certain person?
Yeah, there's a person that I'm doing a series of paintings. I do that occasionally. I find one person that I want to sort of zero in on, rather than just jumping from person to person. And a number of years ago, I did a series of paintings of a young boy on an island in Maine where I live. And so I did, like 10 paintings of him. And now I have a young girl who's posing for me who lives on another island nearby. And so I'm doing a series, and it comes sort of full circle. I like the idea that it's not just I'm doing the pretty scene here, pretty scene there, or one person here, one person there. I think it's interesting to do a series of things. Kind of fascinating.
All right. And I have another question. What was your reasoning at the time for turning down the commission to paint Kennedy?
For one, he was dead, and I'd never done a posthumous portrait. And I thought, do I want to work just from photographs? So, interestingly enough, when I finally said I would at least attempt it, I didn't so much take, still photographs of President Kennedy. I had movies. Mrs. Kennedy gave me a lot of her home movies of him and whatnot, and sort of what I was trying to do was sort of establish a memory of him, as if I'd met him for a half an hour. In fact, I never laid eyes on him. So it was a little touchy for me to do, and I don't think I'll ever do another posthumous portrait, because people come to me and say, well, I knew President Kennedy, and he had blue eyes. Well, he didn't have blue eyes. But anyway, people had their own preconceived notion. Kennedy, it's hard to figure now, but back then was sort of a god. He was a demigod. And when I painted him, if you look at that portrait, I have one of his eyes going off. Well, in fact, his brothers had the same congenital thing in their eyes. So it met a mixed response. It came out on the cover of Look magazine at the time, and I got a lot of angry letters, but it's interesting.
We have a call from Mechanicsburg, Virginia. Go ahead, caller.
What artist influenced your grandfather's work?
What artists? Your grandfather's work?
My grandfather was influenced by a lot of painters. I think every painter is influenced by other painters, and I certainly am also. I spent a lot of time going to museums, studying pictures and so forth, and he was influenced. He had a teacher, of course, a real teacher. He had Howard Pyle, who was a great illustrator at the time, and so he studied with him. But I think with painters, as with writers and as with musicians and so forth, I think you're very much influenced by other people.
Audrey, do you have a question?
Yes, I have one more question. How long do you generally spend on one painting, and how many paintings do you probably put out a year on average?
That's hard for me to say. I destroy a lot of my work. I mean, I find, if you have any degree of success, it's better if you think it doesn't work, just get rid of it. But and sometimes, with working on a painting, I'll work till you get to a point of almost diminishing returns, where you think, how can I go any further on this? But then other times, I could work for months on something. So it varies. I know there's no set time nor set things. But as I say, a lot of my work I throw out. It ends up in the trash can.
I was wondering, what kind of artists other than in your family have you been inspired by?
Oh, many. Degas, the great French painter, I love his work. Thomas Eakins. And then a lot of young painters. I spent a lot of my time in New York going to galleries and so forth, and looking at young painters coming along. And right now, I think there's some exciting work being done with young painters. I think it's a great period for painting today for a young person to get into that field. It's very exciting. There's some wonderful art schools in the country, in New York, and many in the West Coast. And so it's a very exciting period, I think, for the arts right now.
I have one more question. You mentioned earlier you lead a pretty boring life, just painting. What do you do for fun? Just hobbies, movies, sports?
I go to movies, yeah. I really have no hobbies. I mean, that's where I say I'm kind of boring. My life's work is almost a hobby. I mean, I really enjoy, not that it's easy and that much fun, but it becomes sort of an obsession. And I live on an island in Maine most of the time, so I'm out walking the island and doing things. But I mostly paint. That's what I do.
Okay, I have another question. It's sort of odd. If you could be a clown, a colored pencil, or a paintbrush, which one would you be?
I guess I would be a brush, because I can move quickly across the image and whatnot. I always imagine myself as thinking, I've painted seagulls. I always thought myself, could I be a seagull? I love sort of becoming other things. And that's what painting does. You can. I mean, when I went to Cape Canaveral I thought I was an astronaut. When I went on the Vietnam thing, I felt I was in the trenches of Vietnam. I mean, your imagination kicks in a lot in painting, and that makes it quite exciting.
We have a call from Charlotte, North Carolina. Go ahead, caller.
I want to know, are you working on any paintings right now?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Is he working on any paintings right now?
I'm working on a whole series of paintings right now, mostly in Maine, on this young girl who's from another island near my island, and she's this amazing child. I've also done a series of paintings of ravens, and I've spent 3 years trying to get close to these ravens, and you only get about 20 feet from them. This little girl, who's 8 years old, came on the island, and the ravens came right up to her and stood on her head, on her shoulders, and whatnot. So she absolutely intrigues me. So I'm going to be doing probably a series of paintings with she and the ravens. I usually don't talk about what I'm working on, but I'm so excited by this.
How about getting those ravens to your island? How'd that happen?
I was desperate to get ravens on this island, and I finally got a raven man, and he came to the island, a German, and he said, "What you need here is a cow." I said, "A cow?" And what he meant was a dead cow, a carcass of a cow. And so that came, and it brought the ravens, so I'm able to paint them.
Well, I just had to get that story in. We've run out of time. And thank you, Jamie. I'd like to also thank the students from in the studio from Brentsville District and Osborne Park High School for being with us. I'd especially like to thank the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question today, you may contact us by using the email address on the screen. We'd love to hear from you and answer your questions. We'd also like to invite you to visit the Kennedy Center website at the addresses on the screen. There you'll find additional information about this program and the Kennedy Center's upcoming programs, as well as other resources on integrating the arts into the curriculum. We'd like to hear from you and hear of what you think of the Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series. So we're asking you to complete an electronic evaluation form at the address on your screen. This will help us select the topics and resources you need to enhance your classroom experience. This is the last program for the season. We're currently putting together next year's programming. Look for the announcements and join us for an all-new series in the fall. Next season, one of our programs will be showcasing innovative uses of technology in the arts. We invite you to send us a description of what you're doing so we can share your exemplary work with other educators. Thank you for being with us.